Route handlers in Next.js help you to create request handlers. They are useful for making API-like endpoints that reveals to the public and don't require any UI. To consume them, you have to make an HTTP request to the endpoint, and actually to create an endpoint, or let's say a route handler, similar to producing routes in Next.js, you simply create a folder, but instead of putting a page into it, you have to make a route.js or ts into it. And inside that route, you should have a function called get, and this get can be other names as well, as much as we have HTTP methods. For example, you can put post, patch, put, options, and so on and so forth. And if you go with get, what it has to return, it has to return something using response. And this response actually comes from the standard Fetch API interface. It's supported by JavaScript engines, and you can use it right away. And it has some static functions, for example, JSON. If I go with JSON, you can pass a JSON object and put some data, and the user or caller of this route will receive this data. Let's try it. On the right side, I have this Postman, so I can make HTTP requests to this endpoint. And the endpoint, since I have created the API, is going to be the website URL, then /API. Of course, you can make them nested. You can make other folders with other names, but they should not conflict with page. So at the same time, you cannot have both page and route in the same directory, and you will get an error. Let's try to run the project, npm run dev. And now it's ready. Let me close this one. If I make the request, a get request, let's try, and you see I am getting the response with a response code to 200. And as I said, we can have other methods as well. I can change it to post. Then I have to, instead of get, if I try to get, I will receive a 405 method not allowed. This error is coming from Next.js, and it's handling that response. But if I try to post to this endpoint, I get the response again as before. Also, you can have both of them. I can copy this function. I call it get and post. So if it doesn't matter which one I'm calling. If I try to send a request with get, this function is going to be run. Let's try to send something get, or in this case, I call it post. So if I try to fetch this API with get, you see I'm getting get. And for the post, if I try to post, you see this function is going to be called and returned. So as I said, we can have different folder names and different structures. Let's try to have one. And also you can use dynamic routes. For example, if I go with ID and then I copy another one. Now in this URL, the URL is going to be something like API/an ID, something like this. And users can call it, and I can get this number or whatever user inputs as the ID in the params. Let's try to get this value. So if I try to get, for example, hello, I pass hello as ID, and I have to be able to get this as ID in the params. I can say params, and these params I'm expecting an ID to be received. But if you remember in Next.js 15, we are going to get it as a promise. So I wrap it with promise like this, and then I can use this params, and it's completing for me. Yeah, let's try. Now I can get it, and if I return it to the users, something like this, it's gonna be convenient, so we can directly see what's going on. Let's try it, and then I get 500, and the reason is that first parameter of this get it must be a request, and then as a second parameter I can try to get other params or other information in the future maybe, but the first one must be request, and the request type is actually comes from the type request itself. Actually, it is next request because it's a version, an enhanced version of request itself. It has some other properties and we can consume them. I will cover it later, but for now, type request is enough. Let's try it again. Now if I run, you see I get hello here. I can pass other information. I'm going to receive them as params here. So this is how we can have dynamic event routes similar to pages, and we can get them like this as params. Okay, the next topic is how we can send other information to these route handlers. I go with the main one here. While calling an HTTP request, we can have different types of sending data to the server or to that endpoint. The first one, maybe I've explained, like having dynamic routes, and we can have params here. Also, we can have something called query string. So I can put question mark, then a key value pair, like hello here. I put the query string Q and then the value hello. And as you see, this UI also fills that for me. I can have other key values and it adds the request for me. And the way that we can receive them in the route handler is simply by getting the request in the get function, or even in the post, doesn't matter, both will work. So in the request, I can simply go say that let's try what is inside the URL. If I try to write it down or log it or return it back to the users, you can see, let's try. I have this string, but it's not convenient to extract this query string from the URL, right? The simpler version is by making the request here of type next request, and this comes from this package. I have to import it, of course, and then this request now has another property called next URL, and this next URL, if I press dot after it, you can see it has some properties such as search params, and this search params has a function called get here at the top. And then you can name the query string key name. For example, here it is Q. And then I can have it. Let's try to return it. If I return and if I call it, now you can see whatever I'm passing here, the users are going to receive it. Even I can pass with space, and then I can get it here. So that was the first kind of sending data to a request handler by passing and filling the query string. Also, there is another option. We can pass data with post requests and fulfill something called form inputs. So if I change this dropdown to post inside body, you can see a dropdown here, but if you make it bigger, it's gonna be something like this. So you have these options, but it's okay. I make it smaller. I will select one of these items. So we can go with one of these two items, for example, form data or xwww form URL encoded. I go with the first one, that's okay. And if I try to send some data, first let me clean this query string. You can keep it or you can remove it, that's totally okay. We are not going to use it. Now in the form data, as you see, it has a key value pairs and we can pass data. For example, name, Mohi, age 37. This is my age at the time. Now to receive this form data, what I have to do first, I have to expect this data to be sent by post because I have selected post, right? So in here, I can grab it again from the request, and inside the request, which is of type request, like this, I can say request.form data. Something that we have it here. Let me close this one, this method. And this is an of type promise. I have to await it like this, await form data. Now I have it, const form equal await request.form data. And then this form data has some methods, for example, similar to search params. We have to get the values that users are sending. Here, for example, we have name and age. So I can get it here by calling the get and passing the name as a string. I can grab it, const name equal this one, then const age from form.get, then passing age, I can receive the age. So if I try to return it to users like this, to make sure that I'm receiving it correctly, I can now call it. And as you can see, I simply received and I'm returning it. This part is for demo purpose, of course, but in real world problems, you receive this information, probably you perform some validation on them, and if they are okay, we consume them. Maybe you put them in the database or somewhere. So that was the second option, that we could send data to the server. I would say the third option here in the Postman is very similar to the previous one. Again, we can pass something key value like data, like this, and I can call it again, and you get the same response here. There's also another option, sending JSON to the server or to this request handlers, and the way that we can receive it is slightly different. So what I have to do, first from this dropdown, I call raw, and here I'm trying to send JSON. So I make a JSON here. I can maybe copy the same data here that I have. So let's copy and paste. This is a standard JSON that we can pass and it's valid. And here what I have to do is, instead of calling the requested form data, I have to call JSON. Again, I have to await. Now the JSON is here. What I can do, since it's of type any, I have to probably cast it to something, but also I can directly send it back to the clients, or I can call or have them by calling json.name and json.age. They are going to have the value that I have just sent. Let's try it. I'm directly sending everything that user is sending to themselves. Let's try to run it again. And as you can see, I'm sending this data and exactly I'm receiving it. If I try to do another thing, it's working as expected. So that was it, the way that we can send also JSON to the server or to these request handlers. And next, I'm going to explain how we can return and what kind of data we can return back to the clients. As per now, whatever we try to send back to the users was of type response.json. And we simply put something with the JSON format and return it back to the users. There are other ways to return data to clients. For example, by calling this function, this static method of the response, by default, it sends 200 status code to the users. But what if I want to send other error codes or other HTTP response codes? For example, 400 or 500. In this case, there's another option or second option of this JSON function from the response. And if I pass an object to the second parameter of this method, you can see that it brings some properties that we can fulfill. For example, headers, a status, and the status text. I go with the status, and it can be one of the standard status codes that we can send to the clients. For example, I can go with 400, which is a BAT request. Let's try to run it. I have to change it to get now. And then if I run, you can see I'm getting 400 as BAT request. This is useful when you want to send an error to the clients based on some logics that you might have. Also, we can have other status codes like 403, like this. And you see forbidden error here. I can go with 500, but sometimes, most of the time, 500 means there's an error in the server itself, but still you can pass it manually to the clients. That's okay. Also, instead of calling this response.json, there are other options as well. For example, you can go with new response to make an instance of this response, and as a first parameter is going to get the body of the response, and it can be of any type. I go with a string or text. Let's try to run it again. I run. Now I'm receiving a text, as you can see, but if I try to return a JSON, let's see what happens. A message of type of message like this, and as you can see, so far it's getting an error because it is accepting something similar to a string. If I try to run it, as you see, it tries to serialize it. Serialize is a string, and to serialize this object into a string, you will receive this object, which is a normal behavior by JSON serialization or JSON stringify. And to fix that, what we can do is I can simply do it manually. Maybe like this, JSON.stringify, then I just stringify this one. And if I try to run it, end users will receive a text instead of JSON. Let's try it. And as you see, it's not JSON, it is a text. It looks like a JSON, but they are receiving it as a text. And to tell them that it is a JSON, they have to behave it as a JSON. What we can do, we can pass a second parameter here as a response, and it is the contents type. So let me put it as a second parameter, and here Copilot is filling it for me. As you can see, I have to create the headers, and then it has to have this content type. Let me just put it here, and now it's working fine. So I'm setting a header as the response, And the header value has this content type application.json. Let's try to run it again. And now, as you can see, the client or consumer of this API is now getting and behaving the data as a JSON. It is formatted already. And with these headers, actually, you can also have other things. For example, I can set a cookie like this. And users will receive this cookie. Let me remove this. And if I run it again, works like before. But in here, if I go to the cookies section here in the tab, you can see the cookie name equal this value is set to the users, and other types like secure equal to true, similar to what we have here. And you can perform other actions as well. You can put whatever you need. For example, I want to have this X header, and with this value ABC, let's try it again. In here, you can have all the headers that users is setting. For example, here X ABC, I could set and send it back to the client in the response header. I think that's enough to explaining the route handlers. Of course, there are other details about route handlers, for example, to explaining everything inside their next request or next response. They have their own API, and since they have another documentation, as soon as we get into that point, I will explain all the methods and properties inside those objects. But I want to keep this video simple and postpone all other features of these route handlers to the future at the right moment. So to sum it up, what we have learned here is, first of all, we can have route handlers that are useful to getting non-UI requests and response. And to do so, what we can do, we have to create a folder, then we have to put a file called route.js or route.ts, and inside this route we can have different functions, async functions. Of course, it can be get, post, patch, put, delete, options, and head. They will receive a request as the first parameter, and as the second parameter we can have params, and these params comes from the dynamic routes. If you have a dynamic route, you can get them here as the second parameter of this method. You can get the data from the request. If you are sending a JSON to the request, you can simply say request.json and receive that data. If you are sending the data using forms, you can get them with the request.form data. Query strings are in the request.next URL.search params. And finally, to send something back to the users, you have to use this response, which is a standard object in JavaScript. And it has some methods like JSON or text, and you can simply call them and return something to the users. So that was it. Stay tuned and see you in the next ones.